All right, now we're going to look at pulmonary compliance and pulmonary elastance. So what does that mean? All right. So when we talk about compliance, you have to always think about sort of like a balloon. All right, so the best way to really look at it is a balloon, right? So your lungs are very similar to a balloon. They expand and they contract, right? And so the balloon basically is representing the basic ease of expansion, right? So compliance equals the ease of expansion. So what does that mean? What do you mean expand, contract, right? So the lungs need to get bigger, right? So this is what I'm talking about, the lungs getting bigger. So if I increase the compliance, this leads to an actual ease, right? So it becomes very easy to expand. So this is really easy. If there's a decrease in compliance, this expansion becomes very difficult, right? And this can be regulated based off of actual physiology of the actual lungs or other tissues surrounding it, all right? Elastance, on the other hand, is different. This is referring to the recoil. So the recoil nature of the lungs, right? So what do I mean by recoil or elastance? Well, a capacitance is expansion, whereas elastance is contraction, coming together, right? So the speed of ability of coming together, right? So when you look at, for example, let's see what we could think about. A very thin rubber band versus a very thick rubber band, right? If you know its resistance, right? It has a very high compliance or low compliance, right? So if I look at a thick versus a thin rubber band here, so we can talk about it here. So you have a thick rubber band and you have a thin rubber band. This thick rubber band has very high elastance versus this thin rubber band has very low elastance, right? Vice versa, you can notice that even though it has very high elastance, this thick rubber band has very low compliance, low C, right? And the thin rubber band has very high compliance. So based off of this assumption right here, we can make up an equation showing you that compliance is inversely proportional to elastance, right? With the constant C or something. We'll put an O there, right? Times an O, right? But they're inversely proportional to each other. So when compliance goes up, that's probably because the elastance probably went down. So there's this inverse proportion related to these problems, right? So when we talked about compliance, right? So when's an example of compliance when it can go bad? So it can either be the actual structural tissue of the lungs that can change, right? So the actual integrity of the lungs, they lose it. And so the actual, the expansion becomes much more easy, right? Vice versa, if you look at where the lungs are, so they're composed in the thoracic cavity. And in the thoracic cavity, you have all these intercostals, right? You have your ribs that are protecting your lungs. And so if you have certain kinds of arthritis where your joints become very inflamed, and so the actual ribs, okay, I blanked out for a second. The ribs open very simply, and so this compliance can also increase, right? So there's multiple ways of actually how it's being influenced, right? So increased versus decreased is correlated with the actual elastance of it, right? So if we look at certain pathological conditions that are involved with this actual phenomenon, for example, in compliance, a deficiency in compliance, we can look at this condition called emphysema, right? So emphysema is a condition where you have a hyperdilation of your alveoli. And so emphysema, who gets emphysema? Majority of smokers get emphysema, right? And so you have this abnormal dilation of your alveoli, right? And so your compliance increases. So this is an increased instance of compliance, right? This is a pathological condition, right? And so people have a buildup. They're able to inhale normally, but when they want to exhale, they have problems, right? Because you have this excessive buildup of gas in their alveoli because of the hyperdilation. Vice versa, if we look at, for example, the elastance, a pathological condition that is due to increased elastance is pulmonary fibrosis. Pulmonary fibrosis is where you develop fibrotic tissue in your lungs, right? So your lungs are actually very, very soft, they're very delicate, right? They're very elastic, they have this high elasticity, right? So they're very flexible, they can go up and down. When they become fibrotic, whether it's due to some kind of inhalation of some kind of pathogen, silicone, right, infection, pneumonia, buildup of certain fluids that causes this kinds of inflammation, which eventually leads to damage, you have these fibrous tissues, this quote-unquote scarring that takes place on the lungs. And if you remember, when you look at your skin versus a scab, what do you notice? The scab is thicker and the elastance of it is much higher, right? So the patients here, they can exhale normally, right? But when it comes to an inspiration here, this becomes difficult because the elastance is so hard. Is so high, and so the lungs are very difficult to expand because this increased elastance is also the same thing as decreased compliance, right? So vice versa here with emphysema, they have high compliance, but they have very low elastance, right? So the recoil for emphysema is very low, all right? And so this is just a general comparison of compliance and elastance and how they're related to certain pathological conditions.